Hot take incoming. Horror movies understand Americans better than Congress does. Because horror doesn't lie about who culture is willing to sacrifice to feel safe. In order to illustrate what I'm talking about, I'm going to be using examples from Cabin in the Woods, which isn't so much a film as it is a graduate thesis on the societal function of horror. Welcome back to Films for Fighting Fascism, my ongoing series where we look at films that can help give us roadmaps toward a more just and joyous future. Okay, so spoiler warning, because you can't really talk about the politics of this film without talking about what it's really about. But this has been out over a decade, and actually, I think you can listen to this and still really enjoy the film if you haven't seen it before. The film's premise is simple and meant to be very familiar. A group of young people set out for what they think will be a fun weekend at a remote cabin in the woods, only to find themselves facing monsters and horror and death. The twist is that they don't realize that they're being manipulated by a shadowy organization who performs human sacrifices to appease ancient gods, which the movie treats as a metaphor for the genre of horror as a whole. So the movie posits horror as rituals that let off steam, and the people in the control rooms watching these rituals stand in for us, the horror movie viewers. In this way, the film asks us to be curious about what we're willing to watch and why. In one of my last videos, I talked about how horror can be psychologically soothing because it allows us to look slantwise at terrible things that might otherwise cause tremendous psychological upheaval. The film uses this idea of the ancient gods as a metaphor for the really big, dark things we're repressing, and recognizes that horror functions as a release valve for these big, scary things so that they don't overwhelm and destroy us. And because of this, the people in the control room really believe that it's okay to have these sacrificial lambs because it keeps society as a whole from being destroyed. So the people in the control room believe they're doing the right thing, but the people actually doing the suffering are not so convinced. So this film wants us to think about systems that rely on suffering to keep running. And it really wants us to think about the sacrificial lambs that get used, abused, and then disposed of. It's a brutal metaphor for how real-world systems justify violence and exploitation, how bureaucracies convince themselves that cruelty is necessary. It also asks, what happens if we stop playing along? What if we refuse the ritual, even if it means that the world as we know it will end? It argues, ultimately, that refusing to be complicit is real heroism. It reminds us to keep our eyes on the real big problems, even when we keep being fed distraction after distraction. And it reminds us that fighting back can take many forms, even if it's just refusing to play in a rigged game. What movie showed you how resistance starts? Let me know in the comments.